One of the long-term pain points within the Unraid community is the lack of internal boot options. Historically, Unraid has only been allowed to boot from USB drives or thumb drives with a unique GUID, or globally unique identifier. While many people report using the same USB stick for years and years without an issue, there are plenty of other cases where people have struggled to get their USB drives to boot reliably. As you can imagine, thumb drives are a lot more prone to failure than something like a modern SSD is, which makes it maybe not the most reliable source of booting, particularly when you want a long-term, stable server deployment environment. Additionally, since Unraid ties its license to your USB drive's unique GUID, that means that a drive failure can lead to quite the headache in licensing. While you are allowed to change the GUID that your Unraid license is tied to once a year, it's still a headache that should just be avoided altogether. To remedy this long-standing issue, the developers recently implemented internal boot options, so that basically means that M.2 and even SATA SSDs are back on the menu.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
Although internal boot is quite an appealing option, it also isn't without its downsides. Instead of your license for Unraid being tied to the GUID of your thumb drive, it's now tied to the TPM of your motherboard. TPM is the trusted platform module, and it's used to store cryptographic information like license keys. That means that in the event of a motherboard failure, or you simply just want to update your motherboard or platform, you're up a similar creek than if you're USB drived as far as licensing goes. This is also completely just ignoring the cost of having to go out and buy a new SSD for internal boot, especially in today's market. All of this creates the perfect opportunity to talk about a solution to basically all of these problems. This is a 16 gigabyte Intel Optane M10 storage module. It's an M.2 storage device that uses Intel's 3D X-Point lithography. It was developed as sort of a midpoint between your CPU and more permanent storage like hard drives. The idea was to use it as a place to store commonly accessed information like most frequently used apps or files. It's a cache basically to speed up the performance of your system. An additional benefit of Intel Optane, and the reason I'm talking to you about them right now, is their insane endurance. Intel M10 drives are rated for 365 TBW, or terabytes written, and have an MTBF, or mean time between failure, of 1.6 million hours. In simple terms, these drives are designed to read and write a lot of data over a very long time consistently. For comparison, a USB drive will last for anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 read-write cycles depending on your specific model. At best, a thumb drive has around 30% the endurance that an Intel Optane M10 module has. This comparison also completely ignores other worthwhile measures of comparison, like speed, where Intel Optane absolutely dominates a thumb drive. Now, this answers the question of endurance for Intel Optane, but surely drives that are this seemingly amazing also come at quite the premium. Wrong. For a plethora of reasons, Intel Optane really struggled to have staying power in consumer markets. Namely, high-quality SSDs just became so readily available and cheap, and were faster than Optane modules that's just what people ended up going with. The result is that the used market is absolutely flooded with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these drives out there. For example, I purchased 3 of these 16 gigabyte Optane modules off of eBay for $31 after tax and shipping, which is actually technically cheaper than some of the 16 gigabyte thumb drives that people in the Unraid community have been suggesting for a long time. Now, this isn't the entire cost discussion, because, for example, you'll also need one more important piece of hardware to be able to use Intel Optane as your boot media without switching all the way to internal boot. This last piece of equipment is an M.2 to USB closure/adapter, specifically one that uses the RTL 9210 chip. More on that later though. I tried using this Ugreen one that I got on sale. However, after I flashed the firmware and tinkered with it for a few hours, I just outright couldn't get this Ugreen one to work and decided to pivot to using one that I know will work in this Sabrent model that I got instead. I'll have a link to that in the description down below. It cost me about $20. That brings the total amount that I spent, including the 2 extra drives that I don't actually need as boot devices, and this adapter, to about $50. If I only count one of the Optane drives in my price calculations, then I spent about $30. So that's probably more than double the price of a 16 gigabyte thumb drive that would work. But let's look at it a different way. If you're switching all the way to internal boot, likely you're gonna wanna use an SSD for that. And we all know that in the current market, Even finding cheap, no-name, unreliable SSDs is gonna cost more than about $30. And that's not even to mention that to use this method with a normal SSD instead of Optane, you're still gonna have to buy that adapter, making it significantly more expensive than going the Optane route. So now that I've established the endurance and value proposition of Intel drives, let's get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of how to actually get this set up and working. The general idea is that we're still going to boot off of flash as far as Unraid is concerned, but it's actually all of our data stored on these Optane drives, so they have much higher endurance. The license will be tied to the GUID of the M.2 adapter that you have. So in the event that you do have a failure with your Intel Optane drive, you can just swap in a new one with your config and you won't have to deal with any licensing issues. Now, the first step that we need to do is make sure that your adapter actually has a usable GUID, as Unraid will not tie a license to drives that don't. This is why I mentioned the RTL9210 chip earlier, as that is important to making sure we have a GUID. It's possible that your adapter already has one, so to check, just download Unraid's USB creator tool and try to create bootable media with it. If you go to the choose storage option and you see that there's a GUID warning or it's grayed out or something like that, then you'll have to continue tinkering, and I'll show you how to do that here. If you did get lucky and you do have a usable GUID right out of the box, you can just go ahead and skip ahead to backing up your current boot drive and going forward with that. Also, as a note, when you're tinkering around with this and trying to get it to work, please make sure that you're either plugging into a USB 2.0 port or using a USB 2.0 cable. For some reason, Unraid just has beef with USB 3.0 and I just don't get it. If your adapter doesn't have a unique GUID, then we're gonna have to move forward with flashing the firmware on it. Luckily, there are tons of super cool people out there in the world, and someone has compiled a GitHub repository with basically everything we need to do that. I'll have it linked in the description below. I did have to tinker with some settings to get things working correctly, so I recommend watching my tutorial on how to do it, but if you would rather just pause the video and go over to the GitHub page and follow the instructions there, then more power to you. The first thing you need to do is figure out exactly what version of the chip you have. This should be on the product label for your adapter or found somewhere in the documentation that you got. Now find the latest version of the chipset firmware and download the relevant firmware and tools from the firmware folder of the GitHub repo. For the Sabrent one, I will be using the Realtek RTL9210B_FW version 1.32.87.082923. I've only verified this specific version of the firmware with the specific drive that I have, so it might look a little bit different for you and might require a little bit of tinkering around. Once you've downloaded the firmware, go ahead and head to that folder and extract all of that data. Now, remove any storage device that might be in your adapter and go ahead and plug it in. Remember, either use a USB 2.0 cable or into a USB 2.0 port. After the adapter is plugged into your computer, go ahead and launch the firmware update tool that you downloaded. It should be a file called something like uthsb_mp tool, something like that anyways. On the top of the window, click on the dump and view hardware information. Just copy this whole screen and save it into a text file for use later. We're gonna need some fields in here. Now, disconnect and reconnect the adapter, making sure again that there is no drive in it for this part. Now, go into the configure folder of the firmware update tool and look specifically for the config file that matches your chip. It'll be named something like RTL9210.cfg. For convenience, I also have the exact config that I used down below on my GitHub page, so you can download that and just use exactly what I did in the event that you've got this Sabrent drive. Open whichever config file you're going to use and change the serial number to match the serial number of your M.2 adapter. If you're lucky, you can find the serial number in the dumped config that you got before. So open up that text file and look for the serial number page, and then copy that over to the config file that you'll be using to flash your firmware. Now, if the serial number in that dump file starts with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, that's just a generic serial number and is not actually the one tied to your drive. For example, on the Sabrent one that I got, I had to find the serial number on a sticker on the bottom of the adapter. Unraid expects the serial number to be exactly 12 characters. So in the event that yours is too long, either remove characters from the end of the string until you get down to 12 characters and try that. If that doesn't work, remove characters from the front until you get to 12 remaining characters and try that. Unfortunately, this isn't an exact science and you'll probably have to tinker around with it a little bit to get things working perfectly. Now that you've got your serial number over into the config file you're gonna use to flash, it's time to relaunch that firmware update tool. This time, go to the top where it says PG settings and make sure that the incremental serial is not checked. You do not want it to change the serial number you give it. Now select the updated configuration file with your serial number, navigating to it if you need to, and hit flash to start updating your adapter. Now just wait for it to finish. You can check whether this worked by opening the Unraid USB creator tool again and seeing if the GUID error is gone. If it's gone, then you're good to move on. If it's still persistent there, you might just have to kind of keep tinkering with things. It took me a while to figure it out. And unfortunately, like I said, it's not an exact science. Now it's time to create a backup of your current boot device. Now, if you're a good Unraid user, you already have this backed up regularly somewhere, so just go and fetch that. But if you're like me and didn't have automatic backup set up, you're gonna have to do it manually. Simply go to the main tab of Unraid and then select your boot device. In the boot device tab, simply click Flash Backup. This will download a .zip file to your computer. In addition to this zip file, I would also recommend you going and getting your key files just in case. To do this, go into the actual storage of your boot device, go into configure and look for anything that ends in .key. For example, mine says starter.key. Go ahead and back this up manually somewhere else too, or you can even just manually unzip the backup that you had, grab that file and keep it for later. You still will need that zip around though, so don't have only the extracted version. So now that we have a working adapter and we have a backup of our Unraid boot device currently, we can go ahead and get started with creating your new boot media. Make sure you plug that Optane drive into your adapter and go ahead and plug it into the computer that you're gonna use to create the bootable media. Make sure that this computer also has your .zip backup that you just got. On that device, open up the Unraid USB creator and plug in your adapter, again, with the Intel drive inside. And then click on the operating system button and scroll all the way to the bottom and select choose your own or use custom. Click on it and navigate to that .zip backup that you just got of your current config. Also make sure that you select your new device in the choose storage menu. Once everything is in place, just continue through the rest of the setup according to the configuration that you need. Now you should be able to boot off of this Optane drive through this adapter. With your new Optane amalgamation in hand, go ahead and safely shut down your Unraid server, unplug the old boot media, and plug in this new contraption. Go ahead and boot it back up. Since it's the first time that your computer is booting with this new media, it may be required to go into the BIOS or UEFI and make sure that it boots into that drive correctly. Once Unraid boots all the way back up, go back to the web UI and sign in. You are going to be met with a registration key mismatch error. Don't worry, that's to be expected. Go ahead and click the replace key option and go through the key recovery process. Basically, you just get directed to Unraid's license support page, log in, click all of the buttons that are related to replacing your key and going through that whole process. Once you're done replacing the key, you'll be dumped back into Unraid's web UI and you should be good to go. It is possible though that it's not letting you start the array because of a missing license warning. You can either refresh the page or just click on the registration key link there and then move back to the main page and it should refresh itself and have your license all taken care of. Now you can go ahead and start up your array and continue to use Unraid as you normally would. As I mentioned earlier, your Unraid license key is now tied to the GUID of your specific adapter. That means that even in the event of an Intel Optane drive failure, you can just swap in either a new Optane drive or an SSD if you really want to, and maybe market conditions get a little bit better in the future. For anyone wondering how to do this for creating a brand new Unraid boot device, basically just follow along with these same steps. You just won't have a current backup to work off of. I'll also make sure to have all of the links to the websites, written guides, and other content necessary in the description. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you found it helpful, please consider giving it a like and subscribing for more content like this. If you need help with another part of your Unraid server, consider browsing around to some of my other videos. This guide on setting up Jellyfin particularly might be interesting to you. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.